All right, buckle up for this one, folks. We're diving into some deep waters today.
Deep waters indeed.
You all sent in some fascinating stuff by Noam Chomsky, all about U.S. foreign policy, focusing on his book, Towards a New Cold War.
Yeah.
Get ready to grapple with some seriously thought-provoking ideas.
Always with Chomsky, right.
We're talking about things like manufactured consent, the media's role, and how this whole Cold War narrative still shapes our world today. Pretty heavy stuff.
It is. And Chomsky, he never shies away from controversy.
Not one bit.
Not at all.
So our mission today, if you choose to accept it,
I think we have to.
is to really understand how Chomsky sees U.S. foreign policy being made.
Correct.
And what it means for all of us.
Yeah.
Especially looking at it through this Cold War lens.
Interesting.
And its lasting effects. Phew. Where do we even begin with something this massive?
Well, Chomsky, he kind of throws us a curveball right off the bat.
Oh.
He talks about the decline of U.S. power.
Okay.
But not in the way you might think.
Interesting.
He says the usual narrative, the one about superpower rivalry.
Right, with the Soviet Union.
Exactly. That whole thing, he says that's actually a distraction.
So instead of this good guys versus bad guys thing,
Yeah.
what's he really saying?
Well, he argues that by focusing on the Soviet Union as this big enemy, right,
Okay.
it lets the U.S. present all its actions as defensive, even when they're, well, anything but.
I see. So it's all a bit of a show then.
Kind of, yeah, like a magician.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Using misdirection, right.
Yeah.
Making you look at one hand while they're doing something sneaky with the other.
So it's all about control then.
I think that's a big part of it.
The U.S. wanting to maintain its power and influence, even if it means interfering in other countries' business.
Exactly. Chomsky uses this word hegemony.
Ah, yes, fancy.
It basically means being the top dog, having the most power on the world stage.
Right, and he thinks the U.S. is going to great lengths to hold on to that position.
That's his argument.
But how do they justify all this, especially to their own people?
Well, this is where Chomsky gets particularly controversial.
All right, lay it on me.
He says the U.S., they tend to view much of the world as practically belonging to them.
Wow.
Needing protection, not just from other powers, but from their own people, too.
So it's not just about fighting communism then.
Not quite, no.
It's about controlling resources, staying on top, making sure everything goes their way.
That's the core of it, yeah.
Okay. I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Good.
And Chomsky, he points to three major turning points in U.S. foreign policy since World War II, right?
He does.
To illustrate this point.
Yeah.
The first one, there's this adoption of containment policy back in the late 1940s.
Right.
Which was basically all about stopping the spread of communism.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that in school.
Sure.
Then what happened?
Well, then, in the early 1970s, there's this shift towards détente.
The détente, right? Easing tensions with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, more cooperation, diplomacy.
Right, like when Nixon went to China.
Exactly.
So things were getting better, right?
Well, according to Chomsky, not so fast.
Okay.
He says, more recently, there's been this move back towards a more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
But here's the thing.
What's that?
He argues that these shifts, they aren't just reactions to what the Soviets are doing.
So there's more to it than just reacting to this big, bad communist threat.
A lot more. Chomsky suggests that domestic factors play a huge role.
Okay, like what?
We're talking about managing public opinion.
Okay.
Anxieties about the economy.
Yeah.
Even using propaganda to get the public on board with policies that, involve military intervention.
Hold on, propaganda?
Yeah.
You mean like straight up manipulating people?
That's what he's suggesting.
Wow.
He points to the Truman Doctrine and NSC 68 as examples.
Okay, remind me what those were again?
The Truman Doctrine, it was basically this promise to help any country resisting communism.
Right.
And NSC 68, this was a top secret government report that really hyped up the Soviet threat.
I'm guessing Chomsky thinks these were used to justify more than just protecting other countries.
He absolutely does. He sees them as tools to expand U.S. power, justify increased military spending, all while keeping the public on board by playing up this fear of communism.
Okay, so if the U.S. might be exaggerating the threat to further its own agenda, how do they get people to believe it?
That's where his ideas about the media and intellectuals come in.
Ooh, that's a big one.
And this is where things get really controversial.
All right, let's unpack that.
Okay.
What does he have to say about these groups?
Well,
I mean, we generally think of the media and intellectuals as pretty independent.
We do, yeah. That's the common perception.
Right.
But Chomsky, he claims they're actually operating within, well, a very limited range of acceptable opinions.
Oh, interesting.
It's like they're all playing by the same rules.
Okay.
Set by what he calls the state propaganda system.
So you're saying that even sources we consider reliable might be subtly influenced by, well, by powerful interests.
That's what Chomsky's suggesting.
That's a pretty unsettling thought.
I know, right?
And he's especially critical of some big-name intellectuals.
He is.
Like Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
And Saul Bellow.
Right.
He accuses them of distorting facts and ultimately backing U.S. imperial ambitions.
Whether they realize it or not. Yeah.
He doesn't just make those accusations lightly, though, right?
No. He backs them up.
Okay.
With lots of evidence, particularly from the Vietnam War.
Ah, yes.
And U.S. actions in Latin America.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, he points to the way the media covered the Vietnam War,
right,
often downplaying the U.S.'s role in creating the instability and suffering.
So it's not just what's being reported, but what's being left out or glossed over.
Exactly.
That's scary.
And he brings up the famine that Vietnam faced after the war, arguing that the U.S. deliberately made things worse by blocking aid. Then there's the media's portrayal of the boat people fleeing Vietnam.
Right.
Chomsky says this further obscured the U.S.'s responsibility for the whole situation.
So it's almost like we're only getting this carefully curated version of the truth.
That's exactly Chomsky's point. And he sees the same pattern in other situations, like in Latin America.
Oh.
Specifically countries like Brazil, Cuba, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua.
So how do these specific examples connect to his bigger argument about U.S. foreign policy?
Well, Chomsky sees them as evidence that the U.S. consistently supports these brutal regimes, helps overthrow democratically elected governments, and causes devastation through military intervention.
It's hard to believe.
Oh, no.
All while claiming to be the good guys.
That's right.
Wait, so he's saying the U.S. is intervening in all these places and using the media to control how we see it.
He's suggesting there's a deliberate effort to shape public opinion and that the media often plays right into it.
Wow.
He's basically saying we need to be much more critical of the information we're given.
That's a lot to take in.
It is.
So far, we've seen how Chomsky argues that the U.S. is driven by this desire to maintain its power and influence, even if it means, well, manipulating public opinion.
Right.
And he uses these specific examples from Vietnam and Latin America to illustrate his point.
Exactly. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to examine other instances of U.S. intervention.
Okay.
And that's where we'll pick up next time.
All right, we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
If you're already feeling like you need to re-examine everything you thought you knew about the world,
I know the feeling.
You're not alone.
Not at all.
Join us for part 2 as we delve deeper into Chomsky's analysis.
It's going to be a good one.
And explore how his ideas apply to places like Indonesia, East Timor, and the Middle East. Can't wait.
Me neither.
Welcome back, folks. Last time we started unpacking Noam Chomsky's take on U.S. foreign policy. And let's just say things got
pretty intense.
Pretty intense.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that the U.S. might be manipulating public opinion to hold on to its power all over the world. And he used Vietnam and Latin America as, well, as kind of case studies.
Yeah. Some pretty compelling examples.
Right.
Yeah.
Ready to keep going down this rabbit hole.
Oh, absolutely. Chomsky doesn't pull any punches.
Okay, good.
His analysis of Indonesia and East Timor, it's really eye-opening.
All right, let's go there then. What does he have to say about Indonesia?
Well, he points to this military coup back in 1965.
Okay.
Where a regime backed by, well, you guessed it, the U.S. came to power. And this regime, they were responsible for some horrific stuff.
Like what?
Mass killings, brutal repression, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, I don't remember learning about this in school.
That's part of Chomsky's point, you know.
What do you mean?
He argues that these events, they're often overlooked or downplayed in the West.
Okay.
Especially when they involve, well, U.S. complicity.
So why would the U.S. support this regime then, even though they were committing atrocities?
Well, Chomsky argues that Indonesia, under this new regime basically opened itself up to foreign exploitation.
Right.
Western corporations could access its resources, its markets.
Right.
And the U.S., they saw this as a strategic win in the Cold War.
It's chilling to think that economic interests could be prioritized over basic human rights.
I know, it's tough to stomach.
Like that.
That's precisely Chomsky's critique.
Yeah.
He's saying that the U.S. is often willing to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses as long as it serves their own economic and strategic goals.
And this pattern, it repeats itself in East Timor.
Right. Yeah, the case of East Timor is, well, perhaps even more disturbing.
Oh.
So after gaining independence from Portugal
Okay.
in the mid-70s, East Timor was brutally invaded and occupied by Indonesia.
And wasn't the U.S. involved in that too, even though they claimed to be neutral?
That's what Chomsky argues.
Wow.
He presents evidence that the U.S. actually provided crucial support to Indonesia, both before and during the invasion.
What kind of support?
We're talking military aid.
Oh, wow.
Diplomatic cover.
So basically giving Indonesia the green light to do whatever they wanted.
Pretty much.
It's horrifying to think about what those people went through.
I know.
And that the world barely even noticed.
Right. And Chomsky sees this lack of media coverage as deeply significant.
How so?
He argues that the silence, both in the media and from the public, it's a sign of just how effective the propaganda system is.
Okay.
If something doesn't fit the dominant narrative, well, we're less likely to pay attention to it, let alone question it.
It's like we're programmed to care about certain victims more than others.
Yeah.
Depending on how the story is presented to us.
That's a really sharp observation. Chomsky would say the selective empathy is a direct result of how information is controlled and filtered.
And this brings us back to his idea of the Cold War framework.
Right, exactly.
He argues that the U.S. consistently uses this threat of communism to justify its actions, even when the connection is, well, pretty weak.
Right.
So he's saying that even when it's not really about communism, the U.S. uses it as an excuse to intervene in other countries.
That's his argument.
And he sees this happening everywhere.
He does.
From Latin America.
Where they supported brutal dictatorships, all in the name of fighting communism.
To the Middle East.
Where he argues that the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel is also tied to this Cold War mindset.
And this is where things get even more complex, right?
Yeah.
Because Chomsky is super critical of both Israeli policies towards the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
And the U.S.'s role in supporting those policies.
He doesn't hold back.
This is definitely one of his most controversial stances.
It is, yeah.
He goes as far as to argue that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, particularly its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, is a form of apartheid.
He uses that word,
He points to the systematic discrimination against Palestinians.
Right.
The expansion of Israeli settlements, the constant use of violence and repression.
It's a bleak picture.
He also challenges the idea that Israel is simply defending itself against terrorism.
It does.
Right.
He argues that Israel's actions are actually creating the conditions that lead to Palestinian resistance.
I see.
Which is then labeled as terrorism.
Right.
And used to justify even a harsher measure.
So it's this vicious cycle.
It is.
And Chomsky argues that the U.S. is playing a major role in perpetuating it.
Yeah, he sees the U.S. as deeply entangled in the conflict.
He points to the billions of dollars in military aid that the U.S. gives to Israel every year.
Right.
As well as the diplomatic cover it provides.
At the UN and elsewhere,
Why does he think the U.S. is so supportive of Israel, then?
Even when its actions are so controversial?
That's a good question.
Chomsky believes it's a combination of factors.
Okay.
The U.S.'s strategic interests in the region, the influence of pro-Israel groups, and, well, a genuine belief among many Americans that Israel is a beacon of democracy.
In a hostile world.
Exactly.
But Chomsky argues that this belief is just another example of successful propaganda, right?
He does. He says the U.S. has created this image of Israel as the underdog, fighting for survival against overwhelming odds.
Right.
But he argues the reality is far more nuanced.
How so?
Israel's a regional superpower, heavily armed, and backed by the U.S.
So what does Chomsky propose as a solution to this conflict, then?
Well, he believes that a just and lasting peace is only possible when both sides are treated as equals and when the U.S. stops enabling Israel's occupation.
A pretty radical view.
It is, yeah, but
he argues it's based on a realistic assessment of the situation.
It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is.
If Chomsky is right,
yeah,
it means we need to be very careful about accepting the official narrative.
Absolutely.
Whether it's about the Middle East,
the Cold War,
yeah,
or any other major global event.
He's essentially saying we need to constantly question the information we're given.
Right.
Especially when it comes from governments and media outlets.
Okay.
You know, those who have a vested interest in shaping public opinion.
That's a tall order.
It is.
How do we even begin to see through the propaganda and form our own opinions?
That's a great question.
It is.
And it's one that we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, stay tuned as we wrap up this deep dive into Chomsky's world.
Okay.
And try to figure out what it all means for us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Noam Chomsky's work. It's been a wild ride, right?
It really has.
We've explored his arguments about how the U.S. might be manipulating public opinion and, well, using its power in ways that often contradict its stated goals.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So now the question is, what do we do with all of this information?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think one of the most important takeaways from Chomsky's work is this idea of manufactured consent.
Yeah, that one really stuck with me.
It's such a powerful concept.
It is. It's so subtle and pervasive.
Exactly.
Can you unpack it a little more, maybe for those who haven't encountered this idea before?
Sure. Chomsky argues that it's not about outright lies.
Okay.
Or blatant censorship.
So what is it about, then?
It's more about shaping the boundaries of acceptable debate.
Interesting.
Setting the agenda for what gets discussed.
Okay.
And how it gets framed.
So instead of telling us what to think,
right,
it's more about limiting what we're even allowed to consider.
Precisely. And the media, they play a crucial role in this.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Chomsky argues that the media often act as a filter, presenting a sanitized version of reality.
Okay.
One that aligns with the interests of those in power.
He talks about specific techniques that are used to do this, right?
He does.
It's like emphasizing certain stories while downplaying others.
Yeah, using loaded language.
Right.
Relying heavily on official sources.
Even when those sources might be biased.
Exactly. And he also points to the importance of creating a sense of fear and urgency.
Oh, fear is a powerful motivator.
It is. It's often used to justify policies that might otherwise be seen as unacceptable.
It makes me think of the war on terror.
A prime example.
Which Chomsky says was used to justify all sorts of things, invading Iraq, expanding domestic surveillance. It felt like we were constantly being bombarded with these messages about how dangerous the world was and how we needed to give up some of our freedoms for security.
That's Chomsky's point. He sees this pattern throughout history.
Yeah.
He argues the Cold War was another prime example of manufactured consent.
With the Soviet Union serving as this ultimate bogeyman.
Exactly, justifying huge military spending, interventionist policies around the world.
So if we're constantly being bombarded with these messages that reinforce this dominant narrative, how do we break free?
Right.
How do we see things more clearly?
Well, Chomsky advocates for what he calls intellectual self-defense.
I like that term.
It's about actively seeking out alternative sources of information.
Right.
Questioning the assumptions that are presented to us.
Right.
Being willing to challenge authority, even when it's uncomfortable.
So it sounds like it's about becoming more aware of the forces that are shaping our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And then making a conscious effort to think for ourselves.
Exactly.
Easier said than done, though, right?
It's definitely not easy, but it's not impossible either.
True.
One thing Chomsky emphasizes is the importance of dialogue and debate.
Okay.
Even with people we disagree with.
Right.
He believes that through open and honest discussion, we can start to understand the complexities of the world.
And that's why deep dives like this one are so valuable.
Absolutely.
We're not trying to tell you what to think.
No.
We're trying to give you the tools to think for yourself.
To critically engage with the world around you.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Chomsky's world, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, well, that might actually be a good sign.
It might.
It means you're starting to question things.
Yeah.
And that's the first step towards real understanding.
Chomsky's work is challenging. There's no doubt about that.
It is.
But it's also incredibly insightful.
I agree.
He's offering us a different way to view the world. One that's, well, more nuanced.
Right.
Less comforting, maybe.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think more honest.
And in a world where the stakes are so high,
yeah,
that honesty is more important than ever.
It really is.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those intellectual self-defense skills sharp.
You never know when you might need them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's it for our deep dive into the work of Noam Chomsky. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.